Good morning and good afternoon. My name is John Herbst, and I run the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. We have a wonderful program for you today. We have Harvard professor Serhii Plokhii, who will talk about his new book, Nuclear Folly, A History of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Along with Dr. Plokhii, we have Debra Cagan, a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. We have Dr. Sergei Radchenko, Professor of International Relations at Cardiff University and a Public Policy Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center. We have Dr. William Talbot, the Professor Emeritus at Amherst College and a Pulitzer Prize-winning author of Khrushchev, The Man in His Era. And we have Dr. Dmitry Simes, President and CEO of the Center for the National Interest. So again, welcome today. And Dr. Plokhii, we are delighted you are with us today. I'd like to start by asking you, the Cuban Missile Crisis is one of the most heavily studied episodes in 20th century diplomatic history. And several excellent works have already been published, going back to Robert Kennedy's 13 Days, published over 50 years ago. Why did you decide to write this book?
Well, this is a great question. And Ambassador Herbst, thank you very much for inviting me and for organizing this panel. And I'm really grateful to the participants of the panel as well. I didn't plan to write this book. After my book on Chernobyl, I was working on a project of a general history of nuclear energy and nuclear weapons, and eventually I got to the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I started to read. And I started, of course, with 13 Days by Robert Kennedy, and I followed from there, and the literature is enormous, and I got lost in it. And eventually I turned to the Kennedy tapes, the conversations that were happening during the crisis, published by my former colleague in the department, Ernst May. And what I saw there actually didn't fit any of the parts of the dominant narrative about the Cuban Missile Crisis that I had. What I found there was a lot of uncertainty, a lot of confusion, a lot of misinformation. And I thought, well, this is the kind of maybe treatment of the crisis that it gets in some of the articles, but it's not part of the mainstream. It's not part of the dominant narrative, and that encouraged me to look further. Once I started to look further, I found the documents that no one really looked at before, and those were the reports of the KGB officers who accompanied the Soviet ships as they were going to Cuba, staying on the island, and then going back when the withdrawal of the Soviet troops started. So again, I found a lot of interesting things there that again were not maybe known or not highlighted in the history of the crisis. And finally, there was one more reason. It was a personal one. During my student years, I lived on the street in the city of Dnipropetrovsk, today the city of Dnipro in Ukraine. On that street was the entrance to a top secret missile factory where every single ballistic missile that was delivered to Cuba was made. So it occurred to me that I knew some of the people who were involved in the construction and building of those missiles. Again, I checked in the archives, KGB surveillance about that fabric and that factory and what was going on there. So at the end, the lure of writing a book on Chernobyl, on the Cuban Missile Crisis was too overwhelming, and I gave up. I decided to write the book.
I should point out to our audience, we have a copy of the book on the screen, so you can see it. I also have a copy along with me right here. Okay, you referred to the KGB documents, Dr. Plokhii. What are the most significant findings you brought out of those documents, which add to our understanding of this problem, of this crisis?
Thank you. Well, I'm not the first scholar certainly working with the KGB materials. A wonderful work was done by Fursenko and Naftali in the book that appeared 20 years ago. They looked at the KGB involvement at the very top of the crisis. So in particular, the KGB station in Washington, what was their role? The documents that I consulted actually allow us to look at the crisis from the Soviet side, from below. And it is about KGB, but it's much more important in the sense that it's KGB surveillance and KGB reporting on the Soviet military, on the rank and file Cubans, and so on and so forth. So it's a different kind of KGB information. What is the contribution of all of that to our understanding of the crisis? Beyond the fact that we realize better than ever before that not every Soviet citizen was really excited about that Cuban adventure, we also understand how the 43,000 troops, plus the ballistic missiles, plus the tactical nuclear weapons were brought to Cuba in the way that didn't alert the American intelligence. So arguably that was probably the biggest intelligence failure, or one of the biggest intelligence failures of the 20th century. And KGB documents tell us exactly how it was accomplished. In my book, I give one example where person on the ship going to the Cuba got appendicitis. And they were prepared to sacrifice his life, but would not allow him to go to the hospital in the Mediterranean somewhere, because the concern was that he would divulge, that he would tell something about the operation that would alert the US or the NATO services. So that is one contribution about understanding of how that intelligence failure took place. Another contribution is about the story of the Soviet withdrawal and profound humiliation that the Soviet military felt once they were withdrawn from Cuba. Not withdrawal per se was the issue. The issue was how it was done. Khrushchev failed to convince Castro to allow the inspection of the missile sites on Cuba, either by American or by the UN inspectors. And the Soviets were forced to do what I call was submitted to the really strip search on the high seas, when they were forced to show to the American airplanes, to the American ships, to their missiles, to their equipment, to open their twin decks, and so on and so forth. And when Khrushchev was ousted eventually, 2 years after the crisis, the Minister of Defense, John Malinovsky, who was one of his strongest supporters, explained to his staff what happened and why Khrushchev was removed. And his explanation was, never in the history either the Russian army or the Soviet army went or suffered through that kind of humiliation as was the withdrawal from Cuba. And again, that reporting, this KGB reporting that I used and tried to analyze in my book helps us to understand that part of the story. Very important part of the story.
You raise a really interesting point here. So let's follow up a bit. In the, I would say, the traditional understanding of Khrushchev's ousting, I'm sure that William Talbot will have a lot to say about this. The quote unquote ignominious retreat from Cuba was a large factor. But you're suggesting that in fact the actual treatment of the Cuban military was an important part of that, as opposed to the supposed Kennedy victory around Cuba.
Well, Cuba and attitude of the Fidel Castro were really an extremely important part of the story. And the Soviets in their memoirs, this is not in KGB documents, but in their memoirs, I really felt hurt when they were withdrawn from Cuba that there was no farewell from the Cuban military in particular. There were no farewell from the Cuban officials. And the reason for that was that Castro was extremely unhappy with what happened. He was offended by the fact that he was not part of the deal between Kennedy and Khrushchev. Because we made a lot out of the communist or allegedly communist nature of the Cuban Revolution. But first and foremost, that was an imperial in broad sense in revolution, where Castro was not be prepared to be pushed around not only by the Americans but by the Soviets as well. And his pride of a leader of an independent, small independent country was really hurt. And that prolonged the crisis. We still live in this kind of world in the history of the crisis created by 13 Days by Robert Kennedy. The crisis was not 13 days. The crisis was lasting all the way into November, until November 20th. And the reason for its continuation was Castro's refusal to cooperate. Castro's refusal to go along with the deal that was struck by Khrushchev and Kennedy, his refusal to allow the withdrawal of the Soviet bombers capable of delivering atomic bombs. But he also tried to make a claim for the tactical nuclear weapons that the US knew nothing about until the end of the Cold War. So that part of the story is not completely unknown, but certainly it's not as central as it should be when it comes to our dominant narrative or the generally shared narrative of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Okay, I have several more questions, but for the sake of time, I'll only ask one before we turn to the panel. And this actually is perhaps the most important question, certainly one of them. How close did we come to a US military strike against the Soviet missiles? And would that have prompted a Soviet response?
Well, we got extremely close. Again, my reading of the tapes suggests that we get, especially during the first week of the crisis, the image of JFK that we are not familiar with. JFK was quite hawkish during the first week of the crisis. His position was not quarantine or not blockade of Cuba. His first choice was strike against the Soviet missile sites. And that position was advocated at the time when the people who were making decisions in Washington really didn't know how many troops were there. They didn't know about the tactical nuclear weapons, and the Soviet commanders actually considered using tactical nuclear weapons in defense. So Robert McNamara, once he learned about those things after the Cold War, made an estimate, and he was very good with numbers. He said that if there would be an attack on Cuba, the chances of the nuclear war would be close to 99%. I don't think that he exaggerated by 1%.
Thank you. All right. We're now going to start the panel conversation. And a reminder to the audience, please submit questions in the chat function or the Q&A function for after our panelists have a chance to speak. Okay, I'd like to now turn to William Taubman. You're a distinguished scholar who's written wonderful books on not just Khrushchev, but also Gorbachev. Why do you think Khrushchev took the risk of deploying nuclear missiles in Cuba?
It's an interesting question with, I think, an interesting answer. Part of the answer is a series of calculations that Khrushchev had about the world situation and what he needed to do about it. One reason to send the missiles was to protect Cuba from an American invasion, a full American invasion, following up on the abortive Cuban emigre intervention at the Bay of Pigs. Another was to rectify what had turned out to be a missile gap in the Americans' favor, not the Soviets. Another was perhaps to prepare for a new push on the Berlin question, which Khrushchev had been pushing since 1958. And one might also imagine that Khrushchev was trying to show the world that the Chinese communist charge against him, that he was appeasing the West, was dead wrong. But what I would like to add to this answer about why he did it is the context of his biography. He was a minimally educated man, only 2 or 3 years of formal education. He was smart, he was shrewd, but he was terribly crude. He survived Stalin, And he succeeded Stalin by playing in part on his image as a simple peasant. But when he took control of the Soviet Union, he was not really fully equipped to govern a vast transcontinental empire. And it's so by 1962, it's not surprising that he had run into a series of domestic problems as well as the foreign policy issues that I mentioned. The economy growth was slowing, agriculture was stagnating, the intelligentsia was alienated, his Kremlin colleagues had doubts about him. So my point is that I think he saw the missiles in Cuba as a kind of cure-all, a kind of stroke which would shock and awe not only the United States, but his Soviet audience, that would distract people from all of his problems and all of his failures. And the great irony is that the cure-all turned out to cure nothing. And instead, it hastened the day 2 years later when he was ousted so unceremoniously from his position as the Soviet leader.
Actually, I'm glad you brought up that last point, because I wanted to ask you to follow up on what Professor Plokhii had said regarding his departure. So you see the Cuban Missile Crisis, the whole way that played out, as key to Khrushchev's removal.
Well, I don't think it was the only reason. They had a lot of failures they wanted to blame him for. They called him, in their famous phrase, harebrained, hare as in rabbit, harebrained schemer, and they had a bunch of them. But I think, and this is one of the interesting things about Serhii's book, he documents the fact that, at least in retrospect, and I suspect at the time, a lot of Khrushchev's colleagues thought what he was doing was really nuts. I mean, I knew about some of them when I wrote my Khrushchev biography in 2000, which came out in 2003. But Serhii adds more based on memoirs of other people whose memoirs I hadn't seen yet at that point. And when they say they thought it was a harebrained scheme, I think they really meant it, because in fact it was. I mean, it's a kind of miracle that he got as far away with it as he did. When you see all the problems with sending 43,000 troops and all these missiles and tanks and planes, 10,000 miles across the open ocean, trying to trundle them through the Cuban jungles where they really wouldn't fit, and then imagining, as the chief of Soviet missile forces had told Khrushchev, that these missiles would be mistaken for palm trees if and when the Americans spotted them.
Okay, thank you. Very, very interesting. All right, Professor Rodchenko, you've written extensively on atomic diplomacy and the Cold War. I would like to ask you about the breakdown of command and control that Professor Plokhii identifies concerning the shoot down of the U-2 plane. Major Anderson's plane was shot down. The decision was taken on the spot by the local Soviet commander under pressure from Castro, even though the commander's orders did not give him that authority. How did this happen?
It is inconceivable. It is crazy when you read about it. That's one part of the book that I thought was just remarkable. When you have Soviet commander Pliev, who apparently was just tired, went to bed. His subordinates actually, instead of waking him up, give the order to shoot down the American U-2 plane. You would think, oh my God, this is completely insane. But I think this part highlights the main danger that was there in the crisis. And this is the danger of inadvertent escalation. From the 1950s, once the nuclear revolution had taken hold, had taken place, I think it was pretty fair to say that that the leaders, political leaders like Khrushchev or Kennedy, were not, they did not intend to launch a nuclear strike. But the problem was that things could just go out of control, things could escalate on their own. And I think this incident, one of the things that happened on so-called Black Saturday, actually is a pointer to this.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Debra Cagan, you had a distinguished career as a diplomat working on weapons of mass destruction and on energy. Already in this conversation, the role of Cuba, of Castro, has featured rather large. How do you see the Cuban element in this crisis and how it played out, and what this meant for the Soviets and therefore for us, the United States.
I think the book is excellent. And one of the takeaways I get from the book is going forward, I think the great lesson learned from what happened in this crisis is that when you deploy your nuclear weapons on the territory of another country, be really, really careful what you're doing. Be very careful on your command and control. Be very careful on your access to those weapons, who's in the outer ring, who's in the inner ring, who has authority, who has a hand on the trigger. And I think that one of my great takeaways from this and watching how the Soviets then deployed weapons in places like Ukraine and Belarus and Kazakhstan, and certainly how the US deployed weapons in NATO and then formally in the Pacific, we were all very careful about the command and control and who really had authority, and not only just over the launch, but over the care and feeding of these weapons and their upgrades and the like. And I think this crisis and Castro's idiosyncratic behavior, and I'm trying to be diplomatic here, and how he was either led to believe or thought he somehow had control over those weapons, was something that going forward, both the Soviets and the US understood that they had to disabuse any basing countries of that notion. So I think, to me, this is one of the most critical lessons learned. And I think sometimes both sides, we sort of gave a wink and a nod to some of our basing countries. Yeah, sure, we'll listen to you. Don't worry about it. We'll give you a vote or a veto over whether we launch or don't launch, when we all knew, the Soviets and the US knew, that just simply was not true. And I think that was one of the greatest lessons learned of this, that you never can trust your partner all the way.
Thank you. Dmitry Simes, you've been a prominent commentator on US-Russian relations for nearly 50 years. Professor Plokhii details Kremlin decision-making, how Khrushchev did not always easily get his way. What do you make of this? How important were Soviet leadership dynamics in the evolution of Kremlin policy?
Well, I think that Khrushchev by that time thought that he dominated the Soviet political process. And I think that the book makes very clear that initially, at least, Khrushchev could get away with almost anything he wanted. The problem was the Soviet decision-making process. If you would look at how Khrushchev was making decisions, you would discover that he had nothing like the National Security Council, that he did not have any serious national security advisor. He did not have any national security staff under him. It was basically his ad hoc dialogue with Politburo members and military officials who were totally dependent upon him. And I think it really was, as his colleagues said years ago, it was an adventure. It was a harebrained scheme. He did not realize that the Soviet Union was not quite the United States. The Soviet Union was not a global superpower. So what the United States could get away with in Turkey, Khrushchev could not realistically hope to get away with in Cuba. And the big problem for Khrushchev was that he did not create any escape route. There was no serious plan what the Soviet Union would do if they were caught. And that did cost Khrushchev a lot.
Okay, thank you. All right, Professor Plokhii, your reaction to the above, to everything that's been said thus far.
Well, first of all, I agree with a lot what was said by my colleagues, and I can just add that the command and control issues, that what stood out for me in terms of the lessons from the Cuban Missile Crisis, because the shooting down the U-2 airplane, it was just one of those cases. Another case was this really very possibility of the nuclear exchange in the Sargasso Sea, when the Soviet submarine believed that it was under attack, and it was a nuclear-armed submarine. And there was also a case on the American side where, just by pure mistake, a U-2 airplane got into the airspace over the Soviet Union, over Chukotka. And that was at the absolute height of the crisis, when Khrushchev knew that the American strategic forces, the bombers with nuclear bombs, were on the high alert, were flying all the way to Europe, and it could be well mistaken as the last reconnaissance flight before the attack. So command and control is extremely important. I can't agree more. And another maybe issue and lesson that I think is really very important is that the issue of misunderstandings and miscommunications. And it was said already about certainly Khrushchev misjudging the whole situation, that he can do what Eisenhower was doing, placing the missiles close to the borders of the Soviet Union in Turkey, that he could do that with Cuba. This is just lack of understanding of the country, potential adversary on the other side. And the Cuban Missile Crisis is replete with this misunderstandings on the both sides of the divide. Kennedy was really concerned about that. He was reading a book by Barbara Tuchman, The Guns of August. He was giving it to all his military commanders. He knew that misunderstanding was a major issue, and still, you look at what was going on, there is a lot of that on both sides.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Taubman, are the lessons of the Cuban Missile Crisis relevant today as tensions rise between Moscow and Washington? And what are those lessons?
Well, I would like to raise two issues. One,
Please.
it picks up from what Serhii just said, the misunderstanding. As I think back over it, it seems to me there was a kind of contradiction at the heart of Khrushchev's understanding of Washington. This was partly based on the way he'd been able to browbeat Kennedy at their Vienna summit in June 1961. And that in his weakness, Kennedy would tolerate these missiles, or at least would make concessions, having discovered finally or been told they were there. But part of his image of Kennedy as weak was that the military-industrial complex could push Kennedy around. And if they could, in fact, as he thought they could, that implied that when they discovered the missiles, they would push to have those missiles destroyed and perhaps even Cuba invaded. So Khrushchev, in that sense, never confronted the contradiction at the heart of his own image of the United States. The other thing I'd say quickly is I'm writing a new book. My new project is a new book about Robert McNamara. And McNamara was fiercely afraid of the danger of nuclear war and tried to, in many ways, to later in his life, to reduce the danger of nuclear war, maybe even abolish nuclear weapons. And when I think about the kinds of things that he would have worried about, I wonder whether they aren't still with us today. For example, the question of the fear of what happens if your national leadership is decapitated in a nuclear first strike. Who then has his fingers on the nuclear button somewhere down the chain? We know from David Hoffman's book called The Dead Hand that on the Soviet side, they had a version of the doomsday machine to cope with that very situation. So I think the lesson of many of the things we've talked about today is that the dangers of nuclear war are probably still there in ways that we don't fully understand. And I don't know enough about the current situation either in Moscow or Washington to pinpoint exactly what the posture of each side is. But I do know enough to worry about what would happen if we got in a situation where Moscow invades the Baltics or moves further into Ukraine. We try to stop them in some way that we can't quite imagine. It seems to me all too likely that we might find ourselves in a situation not entirely unlike the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Thank you. Actually, let me just follow up on this a little bit with you. I am not a nuclear expert, although I've paid a lot of attention to the subject. And it seems to me there's a sort of a consensus or a view that there was a relative stability when it was just the Soviet Union and the United States and other peripheral, much smaller nuclear powers, whereas today there's been a proliferation. Do you agree that between first the United States and the Soviet Union, now the United States and Russia, there remains a certain amount of understanding of these issues that would prevent precisely a nuclear exchange, an accidental nuclear exchange?
I would certainly like to believe that, but I think I would yield to some of the other experts here on the panel, like
Fair enough.
Radko and Symes, who I think are more up to date on the current Russian-American relationship.
Okay, all right. Professor Radchenko, I'd like to ask you that same question.
Well, one thing that I think that already has been emphasized that we just need to repeat is just to understand that Khrushchev was a gambler. Khrushchev was a gambler. He thought that he could get somewhere with nuclear weapons. He thought, as Bill said, that it was a one fix for everything. He got this understanding in 1956 at the time of the Suez Crisis, where he made some noise about destroying Britain and France. And after Britain withdrew from Suez, he thought that this was because of the Soviet threat. So then he started playing with nuclear weapons. And he estimated around 1958, I believe, or 59, he estimated the threat of nuclear war over Berlin when he made those ultimatums as being, I think, 5%. If you were a gambler and you were, your chance of winning was 95%, you would gamble for sure. You will put all your money into this, which is what Khrushchev was doing. At the same time, though, he realized that he was gambling with the fate of the world. And so when it actually came to nuclear war, the prospect of nuclear war, he ran as fast as he could. And I think this is a piece of positive news for the world. When policymakers come face to face with a nuclear confrontation, nuclear war, they will try to find a way out. Like I said, the main problem is not this. The main problem is the chain of command breaking down. And this is the lesson.
Okay, thank you. Debra, I'd like to ask you to address this from a different angle. Some observers claim that the current tensions between the United States and Russia are dangerous because they could lead to a nuclear Armageddon. Does this logic mean that the United States should not push back against Kremlin aggression in Ukraine or in Georgia or interference in US elections?
Heck no. First of all, I think that the concept of nuclear Armageddon is like Chicken Little, the sky is falling. And I don't think it's borne out by the facts nor the history of the last several decades. The point I want to raise is this. I think arms control is a cottage industry for a lot of people. I think that's all they've done for their entire careers, and that's what they want to continue to do. But I also think it belies a very substantial fact, which is that nuclear deterrence still works. And I think a lot of people want to eschew that. They oh no, that's not true, because I think they want to get back into these arms control regimes, which I really think are a remnant of the last century and not of this one. And so if nuclear deterrent didn't work, I think we would have seen India and Pakistan pop something over Kashmir a long time ago. I think Iran understands that if they were to move forward and do something of that nature, that they would be dust in the wind in seconds. And I think that even Kim Jong-un, who I think is probably the most unstable of all of the leaders of countries that have nuclear weapons capability, has figured out that he won't be here very long if he does something incredibly foolish like this. So I think despite all of the conversation on this, I don't see nuclear Armageddon around the corner. I don't believe that arms control for the sake of arms control has really a net effect on this. And I think that maybe people don't want to believe this, but I think we've shown over multiple decades that deterrence still works.
Thank you. Dmitry, coming at the same question again from a slightly different angle. You have commented frequently about the importance of restoring a certain amount of stability in the U.S.-Russia relationship. Do you think that this relationship is unstable today and that current flashpoints could lead to a major, including nuclear confrontation?
Well, I don't think that the Russian leadership wants a nuclear confrontation, and certainly the Biden administration doesn't want a nuclear confrontation. But let me say two things. First, make a comparison with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Nikita Khrushchev had multiple weaknesses, but he had one, I think, very important advantage of being, in many respects, a product, a child of the World War II. He was a top military commissar at the Stalingrad front. He has seen how 27 million his fellow Soviet citizens, including his son, have died in the war. So when he was confronted with the possibility of nuclear confrontation, from everything I know, he was really horrified, and he had a unique sense of personal responsibility. I would not expect the same sense of constraint from the current Russian leadership, because there is a school of thought in Moscow that you can contain nuclear exchange, you can make it more focused, you can accomplish a great deal without using nuclear weapons. And I am concerned that this is something that gives, if you wish, a potential for instability. The other thing is that there was a conversation about other actors, about countries that are involved in the US-Russian competition who have their own agendas. And very little is required to create a situation where nobody wants a confrontation, but also nobody wants to retreat. And everybody thinks that the other side is likely to blink first. So I do think that we have a very unstable environment, and I think that we have to be very careful in calculating our steps. And John, you asked a very important question. Should we, because of nuclear danger, fail to respond to Russian aggression and to defend fundamental American interests and values? And I think that we obviously should not be paralyzed into inaction by a possibility of nuclear exchange. But I think it would be equally foolish, perhaps even more foolish, to say, well, nuclear weapons are irrelevant and we can do whatever we want without any regard of a nuclear exchange possibility. I think we need to find the right balance.
Okay, thank you. Professor Plokhii, one thing we have not focused on in this conversation, but Bill Taubman mentioned it, is the question of Berlin. And your book actually talks about Berlin. Berlin was very much on Kennedy's mind, especially during the early phases of the crisis. So please describe how you think the importance of the Berlin factor in the evolution of US policy, and for that matter, perhaps Russian policy.
Thank you. Well, Berlin was, at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, all the time on Kennedy's mind. One of chapters in my book, the title is The Hostage of Berlin. And the concern was that whatever the United States does in Cuba, that the response will not come in Cuba, given how difficult for the Soviets would be to deploy more troops or more arms in the region, but the response would be in Central Europe. The response would be in Berlin. And we have this specific discussions about what would come out of that situation and what the responses would be. And Kennedy just goes step by step, and it ends up in the nuclear war in Europe. When I started working on the book, again, I didn't intend to include, as in the first chapter, one of the first two chapters, the story of Berlin. But as I followed my sources, and sources were following the thinking of Kennedy, I realized that I have to provide this more detailed treatment of the situation. And it's one more cases where the things were completely, again, the Khrushchev and Kennedy thought differently about the same problem. For Khrushchev, Berlin crisis was over with the construction of the Berlin Wall. It's not like he was not trying to get some political benefits out of threatening with the some form of crisis in Berlin, but for him it was over. Kennedy had a very different attitude. Kennedy thought that that's really the central point of the possible confrontation, possible future confrontation between the two countries. So again, that what it tells for me is that there is no such thing as local conflict, or that diminishes for me, in my understanding, the chances of the local nuclear exchange or local nuclear war. Certainly the Cuban Missile Crisis is a crisis about the world as a whole. Turkey is involved, Europe is involved, Berlin is being discussed. And that's what happens when the superpowers really face each other.
Okay, thank you. Bill Taubman, Khrushchev's decision to put missiles into Cuba may have also been affected by his desire to reduce spending on defense. He thought this was the easy way to restore or establish Russian parity with the United States by putting missiles close to the United States. What do you think about that?
Well, I don't think it was the main reason for doing it. I think that if the virtue of intermediate range or medium range missiles, the kind he put into Cuba, was that they could reach the United States, or a good portion of the United States, from 90 miles off the American coast. Khrushchev had been boasting and bluffing, as it turned out, about all the intercontinental missiles that he claimed to have and all the damage they could do, but he didn't have them. He had only four missiles, intercontinental missiles, capable of reaching the United States. So this was a way to, as I said earlier, to rectify the imbalance in the Americans' advantage on the cheap. And insofar as it was on the cheap, then yes, he was saving money. And it was really, as I understand it, not so much Khrushchev, but his successor, Brezhnev, who decided they would go all out and matching the United States in intercontinental weapons at the cost of, at a very high cost indeed.
Okay, thank you. A subject, again, which has come up, but we haven't really focused on, is the whole question of US missiles in Turkey. This is actually for Debra. Khrushchev wanted them to be removed as part of the deal. Kennedy thought it was necessary for the deal, as Professor Plokhii describes in some detail, but his advisors were adamant that this should not happen. Eventually, it was agreed that this would be part of the deal, but not made public. How important were the missiles in Turkey to the peaceful resolution of this crisis?
Well, I think they were very important because I think perception is part of this. So, and you know, we saw this later. I'm going to jump forward a couple decades here when Ogarkov was the Minister of Defense of the Soviet Union, and the reaction was to try to take nuclear missiles on board submarines and, you know, go around CONUS and do these operations so that the United States would understand what it was like, very similar to the Cuban Missile Crisis, to have this off of its territory, the same way NATO was looking at doing P2s and Glickums off of the territory of the Soviet Union. I think from a practical perspective, these missiles were probably out of date when they were deployed in Turkey. And I think the sort of angst, the Soviet angst, and I'd love to hear from my colleagues here on this, really ginned up as soon as Turkey and Greece to join NATO. And that, I think, ratcheted up. And then putting the weapons there was another way of ratcheting it up. So I think they were critically important to resolving this because the Soviets and then the Russians have always had a very serious hang-up on NATO's southern flank, especially. And I think it was something that was important. But from a military perspective and an efficacy perspective, the missiles just weren't very good. They had outlived their shelf life. And from a purely not political, not a show and tell perspective, there was really no downside to taking them out of there. And as we all know, the US still has nuclear weapons in Turkey that are based there. And I think even today, the Russians are trying their darndest through a combination of different things, including Turkstream, to decouple Turkey, that and the S-400 from the United States. And I'm happy, for one, as an American here, that we are still keeping those weapons in Turkey.
Okay, thank you. Sergei, I've not forgotten you, but I'm going to turn to you after I turn to Dmitry. Dmitry, for you, the use of different channels between Washington and Moscow was a real feature of this whole crisis. The Soviet ambassador, the station chief of the Russian embassy, Bobby Kennedy, even a US journalist, John Scaly. What impact did this have, do you think, on the resolution of the crisis?
Well, I think it was very important. As you said, John, quite correctly, these were multiple channels. And redundancy in such cases is a virtue, because what one channel would not deliver can hopefully be compensated by another channel. At this point, we have a problem in terms of communicating with Russia. As I'm sure you know, Russian Ambassador Antonov was returned to Moscow for consultations. He was supposed to come back on Saturday. I was told by the foreign ministry on a fairly senior level, and I was not alone, who was told that there was a plan for him to come back. And then this decision, for reasons unknown to me, was changed. And now the story is that he will stay in Moscow indefinitely. Apparently they are looking at an overall state of relationship to decide whether they need to send Antonov back to Moscow, because they are concerned that his return would send the wrong signal that they are prepared to go back to business as usual. US ambassador in Moscow, he's a very experienced, distinguished diplomat, but he doesn't have real access in Moscow, and the assumption is that he's not going to stay in Moscow for very long. I obviously have no idea what, if any, channels we have between CIA, the KGB, and something like that. I can only tell you that scholarly exchanges, if you are talking about expert level, are either non-existent or irrelevant. So this is one area when I think both sides have an interest in rebuilding our communications. It doesn't cost very much, but it can be very helpful.
Okay, thank you. Sergei, I left you for the last question because I wanted to return to the current state of affairs, though Dimitri's also put us back in the current state of affairs. I think most people would agree that the Biden outreach to Moscow on restarting nuclear talks is a good idea. How important is it to add China to US-Russia nuclear talks, given their rising defense expenditures and progress in nuclear weapons development?
Well, that's a very good question, and a very difficult one to answer. Of course, China has long been out there with their own nuclear capability, which they developed in 1964. And we know, of course, that already in the early 60s, the Americans were quite interested in getting China on board, and were trying to prod the Russians, prod Khrushchev, to get the Chinese to join the talks. And Khrushchev was saying, don't ask me, given the state of relations between the two countries back then. The Chinese approach to this has long been that, why are you looking to us when the two superpowers or great powers that have nuclear weapons are the United States and the Soviet Union, later Russia? They have a huge number of weapons, and we're just having a very self-sufficient, small deterrent. So first sort out your problems between yourselves and then turn to us. And I think it's going to be very difficult to change this perception on the part of Beijing. I think in order to change this perception, something will have to happen that also happened in Soviet-American relations in the late 1960s. what happened there was a buildup of nuclear weapons on both sides, especially on the Soviets. The Soviets really just took off until there was a realization that, first of all, it was extremely expensive, and secondly, what was the point of having so many nuclear weapons? You could destroy the world many times over. Brezhnev in the late 60s, early 70s realized it perfectly well, and he also realized that there was this sense of parity, sense of equality with the United States, and that's something that Khrushchev did not have during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Khrushchev was really trying to be equal, but he knew he wasn't. Brezhnev was trying to be equal, and he felt that he was. So that gave him added flexibility and political leverage at home to be able to pursue disarmament or nuclear arms control talks rather than disarmament at that point with the United States. Now, the Chinese are not yet there, and as strange as it may sound, it may actually take an arms race with the Chinese, including nuclear arms race, to get them really, really interested in nuclear arms control. Now, if that comes about, there will be all kinds of difficult questions to answer that also were in place for Soviet-American arms control talks, including, for example, how do you count nuclear weapons of American allies that also have nuclear weapons, like Britain and France, against China, which doesn't really have allies unless you count Russia as an ally, which is not, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's going to be extremely difficult to bring China on board. And while we're waiting, this arms race is likely to intensify. I think the tendencies are going in that direction. And the danger that we've known about for years and years, that other regional countries will proliferate and get access to nuclear weapons in this context, is going to grow. So I guess in the long term, the prospects are not very good. And I don't want to say we're all doomed, but it doesn't look good.
Okay, thank you. We will now turn to audience questions. And we've got a couple of, I'd say, very large questions. One from Laura Kennedy, who's also an expert, former senior official dealing with arms issues in the US government. She asks, do the panelists agree with one of the popular contentions that it was largely luck that prevented an actual conflict over Cuban missiles? So, Professor Plokhii, you want to take a shot at that?
Thank you, John. Would you please repeat the question, because
Yes.
I'm not sure I got the...
Okay. Is it actually luck that prevented a conflict from breaking out between the United States and Soviet
Yes,
Union?
thank you. There was a lot of luck in that mix of things that prevented the conflict. Again, I don't want to in any way question or diminish the role that was played by just fear of the nuclear war that was shared by Kennedy and Khrushchev. But there were cases where they really lost control over their troops on the ground. And that's where really this accident at the sea with the submarine, that was a pure luck, because what happened there was that a Soviet signalman got stuck in the hatch of the submarine. That gave some extra few seconds to a senior commander to realize that the submarine was not under attack. And that was just one of many, many cases like that. So yes, without luck, probably we would not get out of that crisis without minimal losses, really.
We have a question from author Michael Dobbs, who's also written about this crisis. And so, Bill, I'll give it to you. Who do you think was largely to blame for the Cuban Missile Crisis? Kto vinovat? Khrushchev, who's been the subject of much of the conversation today. What about Kennedy or Castro?
I think Kennedy and Khrushchev were both to blame for the crisis, and both should be credited with the Kennedy's guilt consisted in launching all of those open and covert efforts to unseat Castro, if not to poison him. The naval exercises off Cuba, all the ways which the Cubans and in Moscow, they interpreted as preparations for an all-out invasion at some point. That is, as I mentioned, one of the main reasons Khrushchev put the missiles in Cuba, to prevent that kind of invasion. So that was Kennedy's responsibility, as well as his wisdom in deciding not to take the advice of Curtis LeMay and the other generals who wanted to strike the missile bases in Cuba and to invade Cuba. And Khrushchev's obvious responsibility was that he sent the missiles to there, launching the crisis. But then, as Dmitry pointed out, he had a long-earned, well-earned fear of war and all its devastating results. And so he joined Kennedy in backing away at the crucial moment that might have led on to a war itself.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Isabel DeSisto. Debra, I'll give it to you. Let's see. How might the crisis have evolved differently if Castro had a seat at the negotiating table?
Oh, I actually think if Castro had a seat at the negotiating table, he would have found a way to launch a nuclear weapon. I think it would have been an unmitigated disaster. And it brings me to another point about Serhii's book, which I think is really, really a critical one. When you arm your military with just nuclear weapons, you don't give them many choices on what to use to stop a threat. And so, as the book poignantly discussed, when you had US aircraft that were only armed with nuclear tipped weapons, when you had Soviet troops that only had nuclear weapons and not, sort of a conventional rockets at their disposal, you brought things to the brink that would not be applicable today. And so I think Castro did not have the sort of wise, prudent counsel that, despite the lack of education for Khrushchev, he still had. Castro was precipitous, and I don't think he really cared if he was going to launch nuclear weapons, because I don't think Castro bothered to think it through of what would happen once he did that. I don't think he sort of calculated that the island would have ceased to exist, and I think it would have been an absolute disaster. So I think, and I'd love to hear from the others on this. I think as time went on during the crisis, I think there may have been this epiphany among the Soviets that we've got to pick our partners much more carefully, and also look very carefully at what we allow them to do and not do.
Okay, thank you. Sergei, would you agree that an important lesson from the missile crisis is the one Debra just outlined, that it's important as you make military decisions, deployment decisions, you provide flexibility for response. In other words, so you're not left with the nuclear option or no option.
Well, in relation to the Cuban Missile Crisis, of course, we know that Khrushchev wanted to keep control of the weapons as much as he possibly could. There were explicit instructions not to use those weapons issued to the Soviet military in Cuba. And in fact, he was absolutely determined to keep control of Soviet nuclear weapons, not just in this episode, but also earlier. Despite promising to deliver a nuclear bomb to China, for example, he backed out of this because he thought that in 1958 the Chinese were going crazy and doing all kinds of radical things, and he didn't want to lose control of the weapons. And that also continued after Khrushchev, when, for example, during the Yom Kippur War in 1973, or the run-up to that, there were requests from the Egyptians that the Soviets provide them with nuclear weapons. The Soviets just ignored that. So the bottom line is that Soviet leadership and Russian leadership, I suppose, throughout that chronology of the Cold War, indeed into beyond the Cold War, were very, very careful to keep control of nuclear weapons. So in this sense, it would have been crazy, I think, for Khrushchev to delegate more authority to the Soviet forces that were already in Cuba at that time to use those, to use tactical nuclear weapons, to use any weapons. I think he was very careful about this. I think the lesson is for Khrushchev from the crisis is that he wanted to keep control, but it still could spiral out of control, as we actually saw almost happen in Cuba.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from David Lupol, which I think really goes to Professor Plokhii, but then we'll come back to Dmitry to respond as well. David writes, there have been arguments and speculation that President Kennedy was under severe pressure from his military advisors to launch the first strike on Cuba. And Professor Plokhi's book provides some evidence for that. And it's even suggested that JFK's presidency might be in jeopardy from a military coup if a satisfactory conclusion to the crisis was not arranged immediately. Does Professor Plokhii find any substantiation from other sources to suggest that this interpretation had any credibility?
Certainly, Kennedy was under enormous pressure from the chiefs, from the military commanders. And what they advocated was not just a strike at the missile sites, it was an all-out invasion. And they had a very important ally on the executive committee, and the name of that ally was Robert Kennedy. You can't guess that from his 13 days, but certainly that's the impression that one gets when you look and you read the tapes. The possibility of the coup, I see no foundation for that, but that's something that certainly existed in Khrushchev's mind. And Bill already talked about that Khrushchev never really understood the way how the democracy works in general and in the United States in particular. And he was thinking in terms of the military-industrial complex and military as a whole. And the military really applied a lot of pressure, but no, there is no indication that something like that was in the works or could really happen. So that would be my comment on that question.
Okay, thank you. Dmitry, Serhii's book does talk about the perception in the Kremlin about the role of the military and the military-industrial complex. How do you think that affected Khrushchev's decision-making in this period?
Running the United States. But let me say something about Khrushchev's personality, which was very, you cannot hear me?
Yes, we hear you now. Please continue.
Which was clearly very important in that case. Khrushchev was a tyrant. He did not think about dealing with his legislature. That was not a factor. He did not think about dealing with his media. It was very obedient. He did not think about the public opinion in the Soviet Union, which really on issues like that was not a factor. And he had a contempt for his colleagues in the leadership. So he thought that he got two very important things from the Americans, namely, the missiles would be removed from Turkey, and the United States, President Kennedy, would make a commitment to remove US missiles from Turkey, and would make a commitment not to invade Cuba. What Khrushchev did not understand, that the Russian people could sense humiliation, that their dignity was really wounded. And the person who did it in the Russian mind was not President Kennedy, but Chairman Khrushchev. That is why he had to leave office. At least that was a major factor why he had to leave office.
Thank you. We've had several people ask questions relating to the Budapest Memorandum. What lessons from the Cuban Missile Crisis relate to the Budapest Memorandum? And again, I think most of our audience knows the Budapest Memorandum was an agreement signed by Ukraine, Russia, the United States, Great Britain, France, and China in some fashion, some by letters, some by the agreement itself, which led to the denuclearization of Ukraine in exchange for guarantees that Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity would be respected by all sides. So Debra, I'll ask you, what lessons, if any, from the Cuban Missile Crisis relate to the Budapest Memorandum and Ukraine's current position?
Thank you, John. As you know, I was one of the authors of the original security assurances document, and did a lot of negotiating on it. I want to first take this opportunity to clarify something that has been wrongly interpreted, especially since the Russian invasion and annexation of Crimea and Donbass. The security assurances were always meant to be assurances. They did not have the international legal connotation of an agreement. And so that's the first point of clarification. The second point is those of us who were engaged in this understood that despite these weapons being in Ukraine, the Ukrainians did not have command and control over these tactical nuclear weapons. They did not belong to Ukraine per se, even though that has been a statement that's been widely stated that Ukraine gave up these weapons and therefore what happened. But I will tell you that I think the Cuban Missile Crisis and what my colleagues have said about Soviet and then Russian adamance about command and control and not letting host countries have control over these weapons was reinforced by Castro's behavior. And I do think that even in the case of Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Ukraine, and these assurances, whereas Ukraine could have put up an argument about the transport of the weapons back to Russia for dismantlement, they were not under the command and control of Ukraine. And I think that goes to the heart of the Cuban Missile Crisis, as Serhii very brilliantly pointed out in his book, that you don't give access, a finger on the trigger, a vote to the countries upon which you deploy these weapons. And I think that was the lesson, and I think it played out. And I don't want to burst many people's bubbles here, but there was, I think because of that, there was never an issue of whether Ukraine had a finger on the button or a vote in the use of these weapons.
Okay, thank you. We have a comment from Svetlana Sovyanskaya saying that the notion that the Soviet deployment of nuclear missiles to Cuba was without powerful other conventional weapons is not accurate. Of course, there was some SAMs, the surface-to-air missiles, which shot down the US U-2 plane. But in fact, were there other substantial conventional weapons there that would have helped in case of hostilities other than nuclear weapons? I put that to anyone on the panel.
Yes, if I can jump in. Oh, sorry.
Please, go ahead.
Yes, absolutely. There were 43,000 troops and there were weapons, including the boats that were supposed to protect Cuba from the possible new invasion. There were bombers. And the commander of the Soviet task force on Cuba was a former cavalryman. So the general who had experience of commanding and coordinating activities of different kind of troops. And Khrushchev has this in his memoirs, writing that we realize that it's not enough to send just missiles there. We have to protect them. We have to have artillery. We have to have boats and so on and so forth. So yeah, absolutely. That's why the group of people, there were 43,000 people instead of 5 or 10,000 that would be enough to man just the missiles.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. Thank you for Ms. Saranskaya to having us make that clarification. All right, let's see. Other questions? Okay, we have a question from Robert Pacha. I guess it's for you, Professor Plokhii. Have you seen evidence that Kennedy discussed Albania and Russian naval bases with Khrushchev? Was Kennedy asked not to invade Albania in connection with this crisis?
No, I didn't come across that kind of discussions. Again, speaking about the region, Turkey got a lot of time and a lot of attention, and that was in diplomatic terms outside of the Soviet American relations. The relations with Turkey and with NATO, that was Kennedy's main challenge and main headache, but not on Albania.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Richard Denton. What was the role of U Thant, the Secretary General of the UN at the time, in reaching a settlement and getting the Americans to withdraw their missiles from Turkey? Professor, Mr. Dobbs, would you like to take this? I mean, Mr. Taubman.
Sorry, I had to unmute.
Please.
One of Kennedy's sort of fail-safe backup ploys that he was going to use as an alternative to doing what the military wanted him to do in invading Cuba was to invoke a request either by U Thant at the United Nations, and Serhii probably remembers this or knows this better than I remember it, but I think one ploy was to involve Andrew Cordier, the former Undersecretary of the United Nations, who was then President of Colombia, to trigger a request from U Thant, if I'm not mistaken, for further negotiations to settle this. Serhii, perhaps you should pick this up because I don't remember it precisely.
You want to jump in here?
Yes. That was Plan B, I would say. The Plan A was to send Robert Kennedy to Ambassador Dobrynin, activate one of the back channels, to give an informal promise to Khrushchev to remove missiles from Turkey. And if that would fail, the Plan B was actually really get United Nations involved. And United Nations was involved eventually. The U-Thant visits Cuba, meets with the Soviet commanders, including the commander of the missile division on Cuba, General Statsenko. So the UN played an important role in that, not in the way how Kennedy imagined it, but it was an important role nevertheless. I might also want to add that papacy was involved in that story as well, issuing a statement that was tacitly approved both by Kennedy and by Khrushchev. So there was the papacy channel was one more back channel that really didn't get much attention in the literature of the crisis.
Okay, we have a question from Robert Gregory. He says, you point out in some detail the American intelligence failure during this crisis. What about the Soviet Union? Was there an intelligence failure there too, beyond the very important one that Khrushchev miscalculated Kennedy's reaction?
Yes, absolutely. The miscalculation of Kennedy's reaction was probably the biggest failure. I mentioned already the KGB documents that were brought to the fore through the work of Fesenko and Naftali, and Svetlana Savranskaya was, again, the publication now, she played an important role in that. What we get from those documents is that KGB really was trying to be helpful and couldn't pull it off, because the one back channel was established by the group, by the military intelligence. So Colonel Bolshakov, the person who was meeting with Robert Kennedy, was not a KGB man, it was a military intelligence person. Then on the other side, there was Ambassador Dobrynin, so the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was involved. There was another back channel, and KGB had nothing really. And the chief of the Soviet KGB station in Washington, Fiklisov, was really trying hard, meeting with John Scully and others, but he created more confusion. He created a situation in which Kennedy believed that it was Khrushchev who suggested UN inspection of the sites, and Khrushchev believed that it was Kennedy who suggested that. But that was KGB trying to insert itself, and that is just one case where it was their influence was quite limited, and then I'm happy to return back to Ambassador Herbst, what you said in terms of misunderstanding, misjudging, not so much Kennedy, but not providing information on the way how the American political system works, under what pressure really Kennedy was from either Congress or Senate or his opponents in the Republican Party, or the president, retired at that time, President Eisenhower. So that was completely missed. And that was the biggest failure on the Soviet side.
Okay, thank you very much. We've already gone past time. I'd like to thank Professor Plokhii and all of our panelists for a very interesting conversation. I'd like to thank our very involved audience and the questions they asked and the correction we got from Ms. Savranskaya. And we will see you again in the near future talking about security and other things in Eurasia.